I never imagined I'd become the neighborhood rebel at 58. After decades of playing by the rules, I found myself in a battle against a power-hungry HOA president who banned all Amazon deliveries in our community. When Barbara Winters stood in front of my delivery driver, pointing her finger and confiscating my package, the medication I needed for my knee surgery recovery, something inside me snapped. How far would one man go to fight against ridiculous rules threatening his independence and his neighbors' well-being? After 35 years as a logistics manager for UPS, I looked forward to a peaceful retirement in Oakwood Estates. My wife Elaine had passed away 3 years earlier after a long battle with cancer, and this new chapter was supposed to be my sanctuary, a place to rebuild, reconnect with old hobbies, and enjoy the quiet life I'd earned. The community seemed perfect when I moved in: manicured lawns, friendly neighbors, and a location close enough to my son's family that I could see my grandkids regularly. My 2-story brick colonial with the oversized garage became my haven. I converted half that garage into a woodworking shop where I spent hours crafting furniture for my grandchildren. Then came the knee problems. Years of climbing in and out of delivery trucks during my early career had taken their toll. My doctor had been pushing for a replacement for years. "Richard," Dr. McKinley said during my last checkup, "you're not getting any younger. Recovery gets harder the longer you wait." He was right, of course. At 58, I wasn't ancient, but I wasn't a spring chicken either. I finally scheduled the surgery for early spring, giving myself the best conditions for recovery. My doctor was meticulous about the post-surgical plan. "The first 6 weeks are critical," he explained. "You'll need specific equipment, regular ice packs, compression garments, and several prescription medications that need to be taken on a strict schedule." As a lifelong planner, I prepared everything. I arranged my bedroom downstairs, installed safety bars in the shower, and stocked up on easy-to-prepare foods. But the key to my recovery plan was Amazon Prime. Being able to order supplies and have them delivered directly to my door meant I could maintain my independence without burdening my son's busy family. The surgery went smoothly, and I was home recovering when Oakwood Estates held its annual HOA election. I couldn't attend due to my limited mobility, but I received the email announcement later that week. Barbara Winters had been elected our new HOA president. Barbara, 42, was relatively new to the neighborhood, a former corporate executive who'd moved in about 18 months earlier. She lived alone in the largest model home on Sycamore Drive, drove a gleaming black Mercedes SUV, and was rarely seen without her signature navy blazer. She'd always struck me as someone who measured success by appearances. Within weeks of taking office, Barbara began implementing a wave of new restrictions. Her first memo outlined updated policies for lawn maintenance and holiday decorations. The second banned any commercial vehicles from parking on streets overnight, which forced Ted Miller, a plumber, to park his work van 2 blocks away at a shopping center. But her third directive, issued exactly 4 weeks after my surgery, shocked everyone. Notice of New Community Policy, Directive 27B, Commercial Delivery Protocols. The 3-page document explained that, to maintain the exclusive character and ambience of Oakwood Estates, all package deliveries from commercial carriers would now be redirected to the community center, available for pickup only during designated hours, Tuesdays and Thursdays from 2 to 4 p.m. It wasn't about property values like most HOA battles. Barbara had different obsessions: exclusivity and prestige. She'd write in her communications, the words always bolded for emphasis: "High-end communities don't have commercial vehicles disrupting their aesthetic." At first, I dismissed it as typical HOA overreach. I'd seen plenty of unreasonable rules come and go during my 7 years in Oakwood Estates. Usually, reality would set in once people realized the impracticality. But Barbara was different. She didn't just talk. She acted. Within days, new signs appeared at our neighborhood entrances: private community, deliveries by appointment only, whatever that meant. My first real test came when I received the notification that my prescription anti-inflammatory medication was out for delivery. I was in the middle of my physical therapy exercises when my phone pinged with the Amazon notification. Little did I know that Barbara had already implemented her plan, and the battle for Oakwood Estates was about to begin. The infamous confrontation happened on a Tuesday morning. Through my window, I watched Josh, my regular Amazon driver in his mid-30s, pull up in his van. I'd known Josh since he started this route, a hard-working young man supporting his family, always respectful and efficient. "Morning, Mr. Lawrence." He would usually call out if he saw me in the yard. We'd developed a friendly rapport over the years. He'd even helped me carry a heavy package inside once when my back was acting up. Today, I noticed something unusual. Josh had barely stepped onto the sidewalk when a black Mercedes SUV screeched to a halt beside his van. Barbara Winters emerged, her blonde hair perfectly styled, designer sunglasses perched on her nose despite the cloudy day. She appeared from nowhere, blocking Josh's path to my door. She was wearing her signature navy blazer, her power suit, as neighbors called it. Josh looked confused as Barbara pointed dramatically at a new sign, "No Commercial Deliveries, by order of HOA Directive 27B. "Ma'am, I'm just delivering a package," Josh said professionally, maintaining his composure despite Barbara's aggressive stance. "Not in Oakwood Estates, you aren't," Barbara snapped, actually grabbing my package. My prescription anti-inflammatory medication from the envelope. "This neighborhood has standards." Josh looked genuinely baffled. "I deliver to this neighborhood every day. I've never heard of this rule." "It's new," Barbara declared, her voice carrying across my front lawn. "And it's effective immediately. All deliveries must go through proper channels now." I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I grabbed my cane and hobbled to my front door as quickly as my recovering knee would allow. The physical therapist had warned against moving too quickly, but this was an emergency. By the time I reached them, Barbara was lecturing Josh about community aesthetics. "Barbara," I called out, not bothering to hide my annoyance, "what exactly are you doing with my package?" She turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Richard, you know the new regulations. We sent the email last week." She held up my package like it was evidence in a trial. "Commercial vehicles attract outsiders and compromise our security perimeter. The board has determined they're disruptive to our community's peaceful atmosphere." "That's my prescription," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "I need it for my recovery. I can't drive to pick anything up right now." Josh looked uncomfortable, caught between his job responsibilities and this unexpected confrontation. "Sir, I'm sorry about this. Should I try coming back later or—" Before I could answer, Barbara cut in. "All residents must retrieve packages from the community center during designated hours, Tuesdays and Thursdays, 2 to 4 p.m. only. No exceptions." This wasn't just inconvenient, it was impossible. My physical therapy sessions were scheduled precisely during those times at the rehabilitation center across town. "Barbara, that doesn't work for me. I have medical appointments during those times. And I can't drive yet. Doctor's orders." She adjusted her designer sunglasses, looking over them at me with what I can only describe as practiced condescension. "Then you'll need to reschedule either the appointments or your deliveries," she replied coolly. "Or perhaps arrange for a neighbor to pick up your items. The board has voted. This is final." Josh stood awkwardly between us, his handheld scanner still beeping occasionally, as if reminding us all of the absurdity of the situation. "Sir, I can try coming back later, maybe when things calm down," he suggested quietly. "He will not be coming back," Barbara interrupted, her voice sharp. "If you return without an appointment, security will escort you out. Oakwood Estates is a private community, not a commercial shipping hub." I was stunned. "You can't be serious. People rely on these deliveries. Mrs. Chun gets her heart medication delivered. The Patels run their business from home. Jim can barely walk to his mailbox, let alone drive to the community center. Distinguished communities make accommodations," Barbara said, already walking away with my package. "The community center will process this for you. You can pick it up Thursday between 2 and 4. "How am I supposed to get there?" I called after her. "I'm not cleared to drive yet." She paused, turning slightly. "That sounds like a personal problem, Richard. Perhaps you should have planned better." With that, she continued toward her Mercedes, my medication still clutched in her manicured hand. I watched helplessly as she carried my medication away. Josh gave me an apologetic look. "I'm really sorry, sir. I've never seen anything like this before. We deliver to gated communities all the time, but this is different." "This isn't your fault, Josh," I assured him. "And it's not over." As Josh drove away, I noticed curtains moving in several windows across the street. Neighbors had witnessed the whole scene. My phone dinged with a message from Jim Thompson next door. "Did she just confiscate your package? What's happening to this place?" What indeed? I stood there leaning on my cane, feeling something I hadn't felt in years, the slow burn of righteous anger. This wasn't just about me or my medication. What about elderly residents who couldn't drive? People working full-time jobs who couldn't make those ridiculous pickup hours? Residents with mobility issues worse than mine? I shuffled back inside, my knee throbbing from the unplanned exertion. As I eased into my recliner, I pulled out my phone and began scrolling through my contacts. If Barbara thought she could strong-arm this community with her ridiculous rules, she was about to learn an important lesson about retired logistics managers. We know how to organize, we understand systems, and we don't back down from a challenge. I spent the rest of the day making calls to neighbors. It quickly became clear this wasn't an isolated incident. The Johnsons had their baby formula delivery turned away. Marge Ellis couldn't get her husband's special dietary supplements. The Chun family's daughter missed receiving textbooks she needed for her college courses. Barbara's crusade against deliveries had already affected several households. Something had to be done, and I was just the man to do it. That evening, I called my neighbor Jim Thompson, a 73-year-old retired judge with a bad hip. We'd been friends since I moved in, often sharing beers on his back deck while discussing everything from sports to politics. "You too?" he asked when I explained the situation. "Barbara turned away my grocery delivery yesterday. Said it was for the greater good of maintaining our exclusive environment. I had to ask my daughter to drive 30 minutes to bring me dinner." Jim's voice carried the weight of his judicial experience. "This can't be legal," I said. He sighed, and I could picture him rubbing his temples as he always did when contemplating a thorny issue. Unfortunately, HOAs have surprising authority if the rules are properly established. But there are limits, especially when it comes to reasonable accommodations. "So what can we do?" I asked. "Document everything," Jim advised. "Build a case, and get others involved. There's strength in numbers." I took his advice to heart. The next morning, I created a private Facebook group called Oakwood Estates Delivery Concerns and invited neighbors I knew had been affected. By evening, the group had 28 members, each with their own story to tell. Soon, we discovered we weren't alone. Marge Ellis, 68, caring for her husband with Alzheimer's, relied on regular deliveries of special foods and supplies. "Robert gets agitated when I leave him," she wrote in the group. "I can't take him with me to pick up packages, and I can't leave him alone. What am I supposed to do?" The Rodriguez family, whose young daughter had diabetes, received regular medical supply deliveries. "Our insurance requires us to use their mail-order pharmacy," Miguel explained. "They won't ship to a community center, only to our home address." The Patels worked from home and depended on courier services for their small business creating custom wedding invitations. "We'll have to move if this continues," Indira Patel told me by phone. "We can't run our business without reliable delivery service." Dozens of residents depended on home deliveries for legitimate needs. What had seemed like an annoyance was revealing itself as something more serious, a genuine threat to people's well-being and livelihoods. We formed the Reasonable Access Committee in my living room that Friday night. 12 residents, ranging from retirees to young families, all united by frustration with Barbara's draconian policies. "We need to document every case," I explained, drawing on my logistics background. "Every hardship, every medical necessity, every job requirement. We need to demonstrate that this isn't about aesthetics, it's about essential services." Sarah Chong, a physician at the local hospital, nodded in agreement. "This is potentially dangerous for many residents. Delayed medications, missed medical supplies, these have real health consequences." I drafted a petition outlining legitimate accessibility concerns. Over the weekend, we collected 42 signatures, nearly half the neighborhood. We prepared testimonials, gathered medical documentation, and researched similar cases where HOAs had overstepped. Let's be strategic, Jim advised. We present our case professionally, with documentation. No emotional outbursts. We need to be more organized than Barbara. The following Tuesday, we presented our findings at the monthly HOA meeting. The community center meeting room was more crowded than I'd ever seen it. Barbara seemed momentarily taken aback by the turnout but quickly composed herself. When agenda item 6 finally opened the floor for resident concerns, I stood, leaning on my cane, and presented our petition. The committee has gathered substantial evidence that Directive 27B creates undue hardship for many residents, I explained calmly. We have documented 23 cases where essential medical supplies were delayed, 14 instances of business disruption, and 38 residents who cannot make the designated pickup times due to work or medical conflicts. I expected a reasonable discussion. I was wrong. Barbara dismissed our petition instantly. The board has determined that constant commercial traffic creates noise pollution, security risks, and transforms our exclusive enclave into a common shopping district. The decision is final. People need their medications, I argued. Elderly residents can't always drive to the community center. Then they can arrange private transportation, Barbara replied, not bothering to hide her dismissive tone. Or perhaps consider whether Oakwood Estates is still the right community for their needs. The room fell silent. Was she actually suggesting vulnerable residents should move out? Jim stood up next, his legal background evident in his measured tone. Madam President, I'd like to note for the record that several of these cases likely fall under ADA protection. Reasonable accommodations. Barbara cut him off. Judge Thompson, with all due respect, this isn't a courtroom. The board has considered all legal aspects of this policy. Then perhaps you can explain, Jim countered, why your Mercedes was photographed receiving a delivery from White Glove Wine Club last Thursday? Are some deliveries more equal than others? The room erupted in murmurs. Barbara's face flushed red. Security, please escort Judge Thompson out, she snapped. He's being disruptive. 2 community security guards approached Jim awkwardly. Everyone knew and respected him. This was unprecedented. I'll go, Jim said calmly. But this isn't over, Barbara. As Jim was escorted out, Barbara regained her composure. My deliveries are specialty services, not common commercial vehicles. The distinction is clear in the directive. The board voted 5-2 to maintain Directive 27B. Only Tom Williams and Sarah Chong voted against it, but they were outnumbered. As we left the meeting, Tom approached me quietly in the parking lot. This isn't right, he said, glancing around to ensure Barbara wasn't within earshot. But Barbara has the board wrapped around her finger. They're afraid to cross her. Why? I asked. She's connected, Tom explained. Her husband's company does business with half the board members, and she's not above making things personal. When David Chun suggested modifying the paint color restrictions last year, Barbara suddenly became very interested in his backyard shed that was 2 inches over the property line. I understood the politics at play, but this was different. This wasn't about paint colors or shed placement. This was affecting people's health and safety. We need to try another approach, I told our committee afterward in Jim's living room. If reason won't work, we need to explore other options. Legal action? Suggested Marge Ellis. Too slow, Jim replied. And expensive. We could be looking at months or years of litigation. What about the local news? Miguel Rodriguez offered. This kind of story might interest them. Power-hungry HOA president endangering residents. We agreed to pursue multiple avenues simultaneously. Miguel would contact media outlets. Sarah would compile medical documentation. Jim would draft a formal legal notice outlining potential violations. And I would coordinate our efforts, keeping everyone organized and focused. Little did I know how serious the situation would soon become, or how creative our response would need to be. 3 weeks into the ban, disaster struck. Mrs. Chun, an 81-year-old widow and former concert pianist, missed her heart medication delivery. The pharmacy had switched to home delivery service, and she couldn't make it to the community center's limited hours. I'd been checking on her regularly since the directive went into effect, knowing she lived alone. That Wednesday morning, I brought her some homemade soup, my late wife's recipe that Mrs. Chun had always loved. When repeated knocks went unanswered, I used the spare key she'd given me for emergencies to enter. "Mrs. Chun," I called out, setting the soup container on her immaculate kitchen counter. The house was quiet except for the ticking of her antique grandfather clock in the hallway. I found her in the garden, sitting oddly on a bench among her prized roses. She was conscious but disoriented, her speech slurred. "Richard?" she said, squinting up at me. "Is it Tuesday? I need to get my pills." My son David was visiting that day and had come along to help me with some heavy lifting around the house. As a firefighter and EMT, he recognized the signs immediately when we found Mrs. Chun. "Possible TIA or stroke," he said quietly to me, before kneeling beside her. "Ma'am, can you raise both arms for me?" Her right arm drifted downward. "We need to get her to the hospital now." After rushing her to urgent care, the doctor was blunt. "She's experiencing symptoms of medication withdrawal. Her blood pressure is dangerously high. Has she missed doses of her heart medication? Her delivery was turned away," I explained, feeling a mixture of worry and anger. "Our HOA has new rules about deliveries." The doctor looked incredulous. "Well, those rules nearly caused a stroke. She could have had permanent damage or worse." Mrs. Chun was admitted for observation. I sat with her until her son could arrive from Chicago. When she was more lucid, she squeezed my hand weakly. "My pills were supposed to come Monday," she explained, "but they never came. I called the pharmacy, and they said delivery was attempted but rejected by community security." Her words hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't an inconvenience anymore. This was potentially deadly. That night, I called an emergency meeting of our committee in my garage. 14 neighbors crowded between my workbenches and tool cabinets, faces grim with concern. "This isn't about convenience anymore," I told them, my voice breaking. "Barbara's playing with people's lives." I leaned on my cane, still recovering from my knee surgery but determined to take action. "We need to escalate this," Jim insisted. "If the board won't listen, we go above them." We tried everything over the next several days. Sarah and I appealed to the County Housing Authority, presenting our documentation and explaining Mrs. Chen's situation. They expressed sympathy but explained that HOAs had broad authority to establish their own rules. We consulted with 3 different lawyers, each giving us similar assessments. Yes, there were potential ADA violations and the policy could be challenged, but litigation would take months or years, cost thousands, and the outcome was uncertain. HOAs had successfully defended similar policies before. Miguel reached out to local media contacts from his days in advertising. 2 reporters expressed initial interest but ultimately declined to pursue the story. "Not newsworthy enough," one told him. Later we learned that Barbara's college roommate was an editor at the local newspaper, and her brother-in-law worked for the county commissioner. The system seemed designed to protect people like Barbara. Meanwhile, the situation was getting worse. Several residents reported missing important medications. 2 home-based businesses were struggling without reliable courier service. A college student missed an important textbook delivery and had to drop a course. Barbara remained unmoved. At the next board meeting, she proudly announced that property values had increased 0.3% in the past month, somehow attributing this to the delivery restrictions. "Security reports show a 42% reduction in unauthorized vehicles entering our community," she declared triumphantly. "Our exclusivity rating has improved considerably." I tried to speak, but Barbara had changed the meeting rules. Resident comments were now limited to written submissions reviewed by the board prior to meetings. My submission about Mrs. Chen's medical emergency was lost in processing. After the meeting, I approached Tom Williams again in the parking lot. Someone's going to get seriously hurt if this continues. I told him, not bothering to hide my frustration. Tom looked genuinely conflicted, running a hand through his gray hair. I know, Richard. I voted against it again, but I'm just one vote. Sarah tried too, but we were outnumbered. Can't you convince others? I pressed. This is putting lives at risk. I've tried, he sighed. Barbara has dirt on half the board, and she's threatening to run a special assessment for new landscaping if they don't support her agenda. We're talking thousands per household. I went home that night feeling defeated. All our reasonable efforts had failed. The system was working against us, and vulnerable people were suffering. I sat in my garage workshop, staring at the half-finished toy chest I'd been building for my youngest grandchild, thinking about Mrs. Chun in her hospital bed. My son David found me there, still sitting motionless an hour later. "Dad, what's going on?" he asked, pulling up a stool. "I've never seen you give up on anything." "I haven't given up," I said. "I'm just out of options. We've tried everything by the book." David watched me carefully. He'd always been perceptive, even as a child. "Maybe it's time to think outside the book. Remember when you organized that surprise for Mom's 50th birthday? The one that made the whole family realize how unreasonable Uncle Frank had been." I smiled at the memory. My brother Frank had been feuding with our side of the family for years, refusing to attend any gatherings. For my wife's 50th, I'd arranged for every family member to record a birthday message and had it playing when Frank arrived for what he thought was a business meeting with me. Seeing everyone's faces, hearing their stories, it broke through his stubbornness in a way arguments never could. "Sometimes," David said, "people need to see themselves through others' eyes, especially people who think they're always right." That's when the idea began to form. Barbara wasn't responding to reason, facts, or compassion. But perhaps public embarrassment would work where everything else had failed. If she couldn't see the impact of her actions, maybe everyone else needed to see it instead. "She's going to get someone killed with these rules," Jim had said. He was right, and I couldn't let that happen. It was time for a different approach, one that would be impossible to ignore. My nephew Kevin was the executive pastry chef at the Grand Plaza Hotel downtown. At 35, he'd already made a name for himself with elaborate wedding cakes and desserts for high-profile events. When I called him to explain our situation, he was quiet for a long moment. "So you want me to make a statement cake for the HOA board meeting?" he finally asked. "Something that can't be ignored." "Exactly," I replied, warming to the idea as I spoke. "Something beautiful, professional, and completely within the rules, but impossible to miss." Kevin had always been the artist in our family. As a child, he'd spent hours in my wife's kitchen, learning to bake. Now he created masterpieces that sold for thousands of dollars. "I'll need to think about this," he said cautiously. "What exactly do you want it to say?" "Something that cuts to the heart of the matter," I explained. "That reminds everyone what leadership should be about, serving the community, not controlling it." 2 days later, Kevin called me back. "I've got it, and I've spoken with my team. They're all in, especially after I told them about Mrs. Chun." He described his vision, and I felt a smile spread across my face for the first time in weeks. It was perfect, professional enough to be taken seriously, but pointed enough to make an undeniable statement. We designed a masterpiece, a 3-tier sheet cake large enough to feed every attendee at the board meeting. Professional grade with elegant decorations in the neighborhood colors, blue and gold buttercream rosettes, hand-piped borders, and edible gold leaf accents. And across the top in Barbara's favorite font, "Congratulations! You're the worst HOA in America." The beauty of it, Kevin explained, is that it's both a visual spectacle and a message they can't ignore. And everyone loves cake, even when it's insulting them. Inside the cake box, I included a USB drive with recorded testimonials from affected residents, medical documentation of missed prescriptions, and a formal legal notice about ADA violations. Even if Barbara tried to dismiss the cake as a prank, the evidence would be there, impossible to ignore. "But how will you get it past the front gate?" Kevin asked. "Won't security turn away the delivery?" That's when I realized we needed to use Barbara's own loophole against her. For delivery, I hired Kevin's catering company, formal attire, catering van, professional credentials. Not a delivery service, but a specialty event presentation, exactly the kind of service Barbara made exceptions for herself. I contacted Jim, explaining the plan. He chuckled for the first time in weeks. It's outrageous and perfect, but timing is everything. We scheduled the delivery for the next board meeting. We'll arrive at 7:15 p.m., Kevin confirmed. Right after the budget approval, but before new business. Maximum audience. Perfect timing. The plan was set. I informed our committee members, who agreed to attend the meeting in full force. Several volunteered to record the event discreetly on their phones. Jim, our retired judge, prepared a formal motion to rescind Directive 27B, ready to introduce it when the moment was right. Sarah suggested we prepare handouts documenting the impact of the delivery ban. Simple one-page summaries with key facts and affected residents. Miguel created a spreadsheet tracking all delivery disruptions, complete with dollar amounts of losses and medical impacts. We need to be prepared for the aftermath, Jim advised. Once the cake makes its statement, we need to capitalize on the moment with concrete action. I couldn't sleep the night before the meeting. Doubt crept in. Was this too dramatic? Too confrontational? Would it backfire? I called Mrs. Chun, who had recovered but was still struggling with the new system. Her son had extended his stay to help her navigate the pickup schedule, but he'd have to return to Chicago eventually. Richard, she told me, her voice stronger than it had been in the hospital. Sometimes strong medicine tastes bitter, but it heals. You do what you must. Her words gave me courage. This wasn't about me or even about Amazon deliveries. This was about standing up against unreasonable authority that endangered vulnerable people. The morning of the meeting, Kevin sent me photos of the cake in progress. It was even more spectacular than I'd imagined, elegant and professional, with that devastating message front and center. The contrast made it all the more powerful. We'll be there at 7:15 sharp, he texted. Van is branded with our catering logo. Caterers will be in formal attire. Everything looks completely legitimate. I spent the day reviewing our evidence and contingency plans. If Barbara tried to shut down discussion, we had prepared statements. If she attempted to eject committee members, we had legal responses ready. We'd anticipated every possible reaction. The day of the meeting arrived. I dressed carefully in my best suit, the one I'd worn to my retirement party. My knee was still stiff, but I walked with my cane to the community center early, securing a seat with a perfect view of the board table. Jim patted my shoulder as he sat beside me. Ready for some cake? He whispered. I nodded. More than ready. The monthly HOA meeting was standing room only. Every affected resident came, plus dozens more curious about the tension in the community. The room hummed with anticipation. Word had spread that something might happen, though only our committee knew exactly what. Barbara arrived precisely at 7 p.m., her perfect posture and crisp navy blazer radiating authority. Her blonde hair was immaculately styled, and she wore pearl earrings that caught the fluorescent lighting. She nodded curtly to board members but didn't acknowledge any residents. The meeting began with her usual formalities: approval of prior minutes, treasurer's report, landscaping updates. Each agenda item moved with practiced efficiency. Barbara was nothing if not organized. And now, Barbara said with her usual smug smile at 7:13 p.m., I'm pleased to report on the success of our new delivery protocols. Security logs show a 67% reduction in unauthorized vehicles. Our community has never been more exclusive or secure. That's when the glass doors opened. Two professional caterers in formal black attire wheeled in the enormous cake on a silver cart. The woman leading them was poised and professional, her voice projecting clearly across the suddenly silent room. Special delivery presentation for the Oakwood Estates HOA board, she announced. Every head turned. Barbara froze mid-sentence, her mouth hanging open. The caterers positioned the cake directly in front of the board table, removed the cover with a flourish, and presented an envelope to Barbara. A token of appreciation from the Oakwood Residents Committee, the caterer said loudly enough for everyone to hear. The room went silent as Barbara read the cake's message. I could see her eyes widen, then narrow. Her face flushed crimson from her neck to her hairline. Then someone's camera flashed. Laughter erupted from the back of the room. Someone started a slow clap that built to thunderous applause. The cake was even more magnificent than I'd imagined. Kevin had outdone himself. The decorations were stunning, making the insulting message appear like a formal commendation at first glance. The blue and gold colors matched our community logo perfectly. This is outrageous, Barbara sputtered, finding her voice at last. Security, remove this immediately. But board member Tom Williams, who'd always voted against Barbara but was usually quiet, surprised everyone by standing up. Actually, he said, reaching for the USB drive that came with the cake, I think we need to review these materials. My brother couldn't get his medication delivered last week, and he has COPD. This is completely inappropriate, Barbara hissed. This meeting follows Robert's rules of order, and this dessert is not on the agenda. I move to amend the agenda to discuss Directive 27B and its impacts, Tom replied calmly. Do I have a second? Second, called out Sarah Chong from the board. Then, looking directly at Barbara, I think we should hear what our residents have to say. Barbara looked around for support, but found none. Even her loyal followers seemed uncomfortable. The cake sat between them, its message impossible to ignore. Fine, she snapped. 5 minutes for discussion. Then we're moving on. I stood up, leaning on my cane. Thank you, Madam President. I believe the materials we've provided speak for themselves, but I'd like to highlight a few critical points. I outlined the cases we documented, medical emergencies, missed medications, business impacts. With each example, heads nodded throughout the audience. Most concerning, I concluded, is that when these issues were brought to the board's attention, they were dismissed without consideration. That isn't leadership, it's autocracy. Barbara tried to interrupt, but Tom held up his hand. I'd like to view the contents of this drive, he said, plugging it into his laptop. The evidence was devastating. Video testimonials from elderly residents struggling to carry heavy packages. Medical documentation of mistreatments. Most damning was security footage showing Barbara accepting her own specialty meal kit and wine club deliveries while turning away medical supplies for others. The residents erupted when the video showed Barbara telling security, "My deliveries aren't common commercial traffic. I pay for premium service." Barbara's face drained of color. That's taken out of context," she stammered. Tom Williams stood taller, his previously hunched shoulders squaring with newfound confidence. "We also have Mrs. Chen's medical records here, confirming she suffered a dangerous episode due to missed medication that was turned away at our gates. This is a violation of privacy," Barbara protested, but her voice lacked its usual authority. "Mrs. Chun provided these records herself," Sarah Chong countered, as did 7 other residents with medical conditions requiring regular deliveries. The atmosphere in the room shifted palpably. Board members who had previously supported Barbara now studied the documents with furrowed brows. Residents who had been silent began murmuring among themselves. Tom Williams took control of the meeting. "I've heard enough. I move to immediately rescind Directive 27B and establish a reasonable delivery policy that protects our residents' needs and rights." Sarah Chong seconded immediately. "This is out of order," Barbara insisted, her voice rising. "We can't vote based on a dessert presentation. We're voting based on evidence and testimony," Tom replied calmly. "The cake just got our attention. All in favor." Hands raised across the board table, all except Barbara's. Even her most loyal supporters, faced with undeniable evidence and public scrutiny, abandoned her position. "Motion carries 6-1, Tom announced. The room erupted in applause. Elderly residents dabbed at their eyes. The Rodriguez family hugged each other. Barbara gathered her papers, her hands shaking with rage. "This meeting is adjourned," she tried to declare, but Tom wasn't finished. "Furthermore, he continued, his voice cutting through the celebration. I move that we accept Barbara's resignation, effective immediately. Barbara gasped, her designer pen clattering to the table. You can't do that. I was elected. According to bylaws, we can hold a vote of no confidence when a board member acts contrary to community interests. Jim called out, his legal experience showing. Section 12, paragraph 3. The board may request the resignation of any officer whose actions demonstrably endanger community welfare. The evidence clearly shows that Directive 27B created dangerous situations for multiple residents, Tom explained. And the selective enforcement for your own deliveries demonstrates a concerning lack of integrity. The vote was unanimous. Even Barbara's former allies abandoned her. This is absurd, Barbara sputtered. I've increased property values. I've enhanced our prestige. At what cost? Tom asked quietly. The safety of our most vulnerable neighbors? The room exploded in cheers as Barbara gathered her things and stormed out, high heels clicking aggressively across the tile floor. She paused at the door, turning for one final glare, then disappeared into the night. As the celebration continued, Kevin appeared beside me, chef's coat still pristine despite the kitchen work. Was that too much? He asked, watching residents eagerly cutting slices of his creation. I shook my head, observing neighbors laughing, talking, reuniting after weeks of isolation. That was exactly enough. The cake got their attention, but the evidence did the real work. Kevin smiled. Glad I could help. And for what it's worth, it's one of my best cakes. Vanilla buttercream with raspberry filling. Jim approached, plate in hand. Delicious rebellion, he said, taking another bite. Best HOA meeting I've ever attended. Now, 6 months later, delivery vans come and go without issue. Josh, the Amazon driver, and I have become friends. He even brings treats for my grandkids when they visit. My knee has fully recovered, the cane relegated to the back of my closet. The story of the cake rebellion, as neighbors now call it, has become community legend. Someone framed a photo of it for the community center wall with the caption, "Let them eat cake and receive their packages." Tom Williams leads a more reasonable HOA focused on actual community needs. His first official act was to establish a special committee for residents with accessibility concerns to ensure rules never endanger anyone again. I declined his offer to chair it. I've had enough HOA politics to last a lifetime, but I serve as an advisor. Mrs. Chun is doing well and plays piano at our new quarterly neighborhood gatherings. Last month, she performed Chopin while residents enjoyed coffee and conversation. The community feels alive again, connected in ways that transcend property values and exclusivity ratings. The infamous Directive 27B was replaced with a sensible policy. Deliveries are welcome anytime between 7 a.m. and 8 p.m. For security concerns, residents can request photo verification of deliveries, but no one is turned away. The community center still accepts packages for residents who prefer centralized delivery, but it's an option, not a requirement. Sometimes, standing up against unreasonable power requires creativity, courage, and a little bit of frosting. In communities across America, real freedom includes the right to receive the deliveries you need without interference from petty tyrants. As for Barbara, she moved to a gated community across town. I sent her a housewarming gift, a small cake that simply read, "Enjoy your new home." Delivered by Amazon, of course. Josh took a photo of her accepting it with a reluctant smile. Some lessons are learned the hard way. Last week, I got a surprising call. The neighboring community's HOA was considering similar delivery restrictions. Would I be willing to share our experience? I smiled as I agreed to help. Sometimes the most important packages we receive aren't things at all. They're the opportunities to stand up for what's right, to protect our neighbors, and to remind those in power who they really work for. Kevin's Cake Bakery has seen an uptick in orders for HOA meetings across the county. Apparently, we started a trend of statement cakes at contentious community gatherings. He tells me the most popular message is still the original. You're the worst HOA in America, but he's created variations. Dictators need not apply, and remember who you work for, are recent favorites. My son David jokes that I've found my retirement calling as a HOA revolutionary. I prefer to think of myself as a community problem solver. After all, my logistics career taught me that delivery systems matter, whether they're delivering packages, medications, or necessary wake-up calls to those who abuse their power. And those are the kind of deliveries that no HOA should ever be able to turn away.